Hello and welcome to this episode of ThePrint Mind Over Matter. I have with me today Ila Kulshresht, who is a licensed clinical psychologist. And we are going to talk about something that often doesn't get discussed when we talk about therapy. What does it mean to be a queer affirmative therapist, and what does queer affirmative therapy mean? So Ila is going to tell us more about this. Hi Ila, just tell us, okay, you are a queer affirmative therapist. So what does it mean?
So the idea is that when you're working with any population which has specific needs, then therapists must teach themselves the unique needs of that population, learn how best to affirm their growth process, and also learn how not to be damaging or detrimental to their growth, which sometimes happens because common sense therapy sometimes takes into account what is popular beliefs around a culture, right? It doesn't take into account that there are certain voices and certain people who are not as heard. So affirmative therapy, queer affirmative therapy, talks about can therapists actually validate, advocate, and affirm identities of their clients, as opposed to practicing classical psychotherapy, which may sometimes dismiss that identity is not the biggest component in someone's well-being.
Okay. So Ila, when you say you're a queer affirmative therapist, does it mean that you would only sort of work with people who identify as queer, and people who don't identify as queer would probably not take sessions or something like that?
No. So it basically means that the general assumption is that if somebody is a licensed clinical psychologist, they have the training to work with everybody. The reason I talk a lot about and very explicitly put it out there that I'm a queer affirmative therapist is because there are a lot of things that our basic training does not sensitize us to. And I think there is value in sort of letting others know that you have done the extra work to understand where somebody's life situation is arising from, what their context is, how that context is playing into the mental health experiences of that person, because otherwise we tend to sometimes have a really biomedical or a pathologizing sort of approach, which says that the person is the issue, but sometimes the person is not the issue, the context is the issue, right? A lot of queer mental health issues are to do with the fact that the context is not supportive, and hence the person is experiencing a lot of distress because they're experiencing prejudice, they're experiencing discrimination, they're experiencing all sorts of unpleasant experiences around their identity, and they're not the problem, the context is, which is manifesting mental health issues.
Okay. So could you tell us are there any specific areas where queer people face the identity? I understand would obviously be the primary, but there are any other certain areas where they possibly struggle the most? Also, one more thing, because you said that queer affirmative therapy, I'm assuming is also not we might not have as many queer affirmative therapists. So I'm assuming this, of course, but I'm also wondering if that, because we do talk about how mental health professionals are very less in India as compared to the needs of people here. So I'm wondering what happens then when that, people still are not very comfortable with the idea of, probably sometimes even a person himself or herself or however they like to address themselves, are still not okay or have still not made peace with who they are. And then there's that pressure and everything else. So does it put more stress in a way on sometimes on therapists, because they also have to cater to now a kind of population which already has probably more issues than, let's say, if I identify as straight?
So I think there is, so let's divide this into two. The first part is about what are the sort of challenges that queer communities face. There are, in therapy we talk about them as unique life stresses, which is to mean that yes, when there is an exam, they also have exam anxiety, just like any other cis-het person. But there are also very unique situations in their life which become stressful and become challenging and are impacting their mental health. For example, the idea of coming out, right? Like I've had so many people ask my queer friends that, when did you decide to come out? Or who was the person you came out to? And, the assumption is almost as if it's a singular event, except it's not a singular event, right? Like, suppose I was queer and I met you the first time, I would have to negotiate whether I should let you know that I'm queer as I meet you. So every single new person that I come across, there is a negotiation happening in a queer individual's mind of, should I come out to this person? Should I not come out to this person? Is it safe? What are the consequences of this? And that's actually not the person's problem, right? It's the context's problem. We assume a heteronormative world. We assume that everybody that we meet is a cis-het person. And that is creating so much of mental, negotiation and anxiety and just conflict for an individual, because as a society, we assume certain things. So when we say that queer individuals face more challenges, I'm not sure if they face more challenges because of them being queer or because we live in a very heteronormative world which assumes everybody to be cisgendered, which assumes everybody to be straight. And as a consequence, there is every single day some discrimination that this person is going through. And obviously, if I'm in an abusive, discriminatory environment, I will develop mental health concerns, right? A lot of research papers get written on queer individuals are more prone to suicide. There is a problem in that sort of thought process, because being queer doesn't make somebody more likely to attempt suicide. Their circumstances push people towards, taking steps which are difficult otherwise for them to cope with. So I would say, I think, and that's what affirmative therapy and affirmative stance talks about, that can we as society, as members of society who may identify as cis-het, take on that responsibility to not carry these assumptions constantly. Can I, as a person, in my capacity, ensure that every client that comes to me is not met with this assumption where I assume that they're straight and they're cisgendered? I ask them how they want to be addressed. I don't assume that the name on their paper is the name that they want to be addressed as, right? So it is in slowly building a society which takes into account that when we're not doing these things, we're discriminating against a large section of society.
Because you've spoken about this, and I understand that there's a context where actually this becomes an issue. And I'm sure, like, when I first came to Delhi, and it was much later that one of my friends had felt safe enough, probably, and I was very confused, because for some reason I thought that, but we are all liberal students studying in a Delhi university, and having discussions constantly in a classroom, and yet he had to decide when he felt safe enough for him to come tell. And again, it was not like we were a huge bunch of friends, and I remember him not talking about it to everybody at the same go. In fact, I think me and another friend were two of the first people, and then it was much later when he decided. And so would you have anything that, if I'm a friend of somebody who probably is struggling with identity and would maybe want to at least talk about their experiences, because it does happen. Let's say I have a friend who's queer, and I go on a date and I come back and tell, I went on a date and this happened, and maybe this person is trying to understand whether or not he or she can tell me about their experience, because what if I take a step back and start judging them that, oh, you went out with a man, whatever it is, right? So I want to know, how can cishet people, if I'm a friend, I have somebody who I know, how can we actually make them feel safer enough? I'm not saying to come out, maybe, just to be themselves.
So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because, I talk about this so often now, that how did my journey to wanting to be a queer affirmative therapist start? Because I also identify as cishet, right? So very often people are like, so then why do you care? And, okay. Or are you closeted and you're not just telling people, right? Like, so I have to be queer to want to work with queer populations, apparently. And I always talk about this example where, like, one of a really important person in my life is queer. And I think when we were all younger, I knew that they were queer, but I think they were still in the process of kind of negotiating that, figuring that out for themselves, because it's also so much of unlearning in your own mind that's happening for this person, right? And I remember I couldn't understand why it was such a hard negotiation, because I learned to love and care for this person much before I understood what queerness was. So I was like, doesn't matter, like, how does it affect anything? And then I remember, like, trying to understand, and I came home and I spoke to my elder sister, closest person in the world. I know she would, like, happily, like, donate blood for me and, like, all of that. And, I was just sitting with her and I was like, what would you say if I told you I was queer? And she looked at me and she paused for a second and she was like, and this is the most liberal person I can think of in my life. And she was like, I would just ask you to go maybe somewhere abroad to study then and live there. And it baffled me, because here was this person who gives me all acceptance, and I had to ask her, what do you mean? Like, why should I have to live separately from you in order for you to be okay with me being queer? And she was like, no, because it's not safe for you here. And here was this person who suddenly, like, my mind was like, so the choice for me to live authentically, if I was queer, would mean to not live with my family, to be myself. The people who I have, never felt any questioning of whether they accept me or not, or live as a closeted person. So I think that was my sort of beginning into this. And I think from then, I've always talked to people about educating yourself is one part. The other part of it is, can you recognize privilege that you hold as a cis-het person, and the access, the resources, the power, the voice that comes with it, in how you interact with your friends who may be struggling with their identities at that moment. So, what I said in the context of therapy also applies to friends. Can I not assume that if somebody said they went on a date, that they went out with a man? If I go on a date and start, if I start dating someone, can I refer to them as my partner as opposed to my boyfriend? When I meet people, if I'm hosting friends of friends at home, when I meet people the first time, can I ask them, how would you like me to address you? Right? Like, can I not assume that everybody gets along with their family, right? Like, people's families are not always their biological families. People's names are not what they were assigned at birth. People have... Can I recognize as a person that people have the right to self-determination? And if they do, then am I recognizing that in how I'm interacting with them? That would be in even basic things like, hey, let's go shopping for tomorrow's Christmas party. Am I going to assume what this person should want to wear because they look a certain way? Or am I going to ask them, hey, what is the kind of store you would like to go to? What floor should we go to? All of that slowly makes space. And if what is allyship? Like when we talk about queer allyship, we're typically saying people who don't identify as that identity, can they recognize that they still hold a role and a responsibility in how they affirm those identities, right? Queer individuals are allies to other queer individuals, right? Similarly, cishet people are allies to queer individuals, and can we recognize the role that we play in that? If someone's being a jerk to my friend, can I speak up, or do I expect them to have to carry that burden every time on their own? Right. So it's in the smaller things, in how you advocate every day. How do you use privilege to make things more visible and give more access to people that you love?
Okay. So this is my last question. So actually, since I also work with reviewing movies, so the whole of last year, I think, at least there have been at least certain moments, I would call them moments as opposed to, I don't know, a breakthrough moment, because I feel like that then gives too much of power where something should by now at least be default. There have been representations whether we like them or not, whether we have issues and what kind. Obviously, I'm not going deep into that. But I want to ask you, how important is that? Because, we feel like in India, there are two things that we sort of can't live without. One is our form of entertainment, the other is food. I feel that.
That's true. Yes.
And with so many OTT platforms, everything, I feel like on one good thing is that now probably we have more access to hear more kind of diverse stories. But do you think it's also equally important for queer individuals to feel at least, as a starting point when they are trying to probably embrace their own identities, that, okay, I do see a representation on a screen and I do know that this is a film or a show or a moment which will be watched by all kind of people. And do you think that also creates a space where they at least feel that, okay, there is somewhat of a space for me to maybe express myself in certain ways, as opposed to where, at least I remember never seeing anything like that until it went into a banned movie, and then that's why you get to hear about it. But as a mainstream idea, we don't really get queer representations in India. So.
I think obviously the response has been all over the map in terms of how people have reacted to these movies, right? But as a person who's talking to individuals from queer spaces almost weekly in therapy, my biggest takeaway from the last year was that a lot of people found a lot of validation. Right? Like my most favorite story of this is, I can't remember the name of the movie. There was a movie where there was there's a sports teacher and a cop.
Badhai Do.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had one of my clients who saw the movie first time alone. Nobody wanted to go with them. Really enjoyed it. Had felt so validated. Cried in the movie. Came back. Told their family, "Will you come watch this with me?" Family went, watched it. Had a whole other set of reactions. Started so many conversations between all of them, where this person was almost upset that this was still in the throes of the pandemic. So they were like, I'm just going to take all of my friends to watch this in the hall because I want this movie to earn some money, because I felt very validated by it. And there is some sort of story like that with every movie. We can critique each of them and say that, this was not well represented, this needed larger lens, this needed to be more nuanced. And I agree with all of that. But I think the last year was really good in terms of just the joy that I saw so many of my clients experience with the different aspects of these movies that they related to. Because art does that, right? It gives you the words which you couldn't articulate so far to be like, this is what I was trying to say. Can you please just watch this? Because it feels really good to me in terms of what I was trying to get at. And that's really powerful and really beautiful. And just for that, I think we're going in a good direction.
Okay. So that is like, I think, a very heartfelt moment that I also had while talking to Ila. But yes, representation matters, of course. Talking about things you're not sure of matters. Asking questions is important. Learning is important, yes, but I, as a person, feel like unlearning is more important, especially when it comes to understanding what people who identify as queer go through, but also in terms of mental health, because we all grow up with a certain set of ideas that we think are so-called normal, and that's how the struggle for a lot of us begin, because when we feel like, oh, this is not how I feel, I don't feel the way I'm supposed to feel, is where this dissonance, this disconnect is experienced by a lot of people. Thank you, Ila, so much for coming here and talking to me. The Queer Pride Walk is also going to be held in Delhi this Sunday. So I think this is like a great moment to have this conversation. I hope you enjoyed the episode, but more importantly, I hope this also starts conversations for you, whoever is watching this, and that you are also able to get something out of it. Thank you.